everyone, it's Annabelle. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be repotting some Phals with you guys. These are some ordinary complex hybrid Phalaenopsis. One has a pretty peloric flower that's focusing or not. And the other is like a purple flowered Phal, this big one here. Flower spike is facing in the complete opposite direction. They've kind of finished flowering, still got a couple of flowers on them, but for the most part finished flowering. They're putting out new roots and they are drinking their pots dry way too fast. I also thought it would be a really fun idea to do a Q&A with you guys, answering some of your questions in this repot and just having like a chatty, relaxed repot while I repot these two Phals. When I first started semi-hydro, I was using these pots. And they are just not suited at all because I drilled the reservoir holes way too low on them, which is really unfortunate. So it means that they dry out exceptionally quickly. Like this is bone dry, I can feel by the weight. The Phals aren't doing too badly. One of them is starting to show some yellowing leaf tips from where it's drying out quite a bit between waterings, which isn't ideal in semi-hydro. So I thought I'd just repot them on camera with you guys. I put a post up on my YouTube community tab and also on Instagram asking if you guys had any questions or topics you'd like me to talk about while repotting. So I'm just going to talk through in order some of those questions. The first one, which is related to, obviously I said that my Phals are drying out too much, is do my orchids get a dry period in semi-hydro and self-watering? And the answer is no, they're not supposed to, and bad things usually happen when they do. I don't know how wet dry periods and staying dry for so long is managed in organic, because my orchids, when they dry out, they get angry, they look horrible. They really need the constant moisture in my care, in my environment. They've obviously adapted to semi-hydro, so they're probably adapted to taking lots of water up. So as soon as I let them run dry, I tend to get issues, dehydration becoming apparent. They don't like it. Leca also, when it's dry, can desiccate root tips. So inorganic material or wicking material in general shouldn't be left to dry out for too long, except for if you're giving an orchid a winter rest and it's not growing or producing any new root tips. Then it's fine to let it dry out. Although I am a little bit wary of letting leca stay dry for too long when it's warm. So like with my Chatty types, I still give them a little bit of moisture with leca or ceramis. Anything wicking or porous that dries out can suck moisture from roots. So inorganic shouldn't be left dry for too long. The point of wet dry cycles is to allow like reoxygenation around the root zone, and because inorganic material is hard and usually has quite a lot of air ratio within the media and between in gaps in the media, it's not as vital to do wet dry cycles as it is with something like organic media. In fact, it's not vital at all, and I don't do it, and when I do, it's a bad thing. So I hope that that addresses the first question. So another question that I got was, when is it necessary to repot orchids, and advice on how to repot. So obviously that's quite a big topic, but there are a couple of instances where you would need to repot your orchid. The first is that its roots have taken over the pot, which means that with a lot of roots in a small pot, it's going to be drying out very quickly, which means you're going to have to increase the amount you're watering. That might be difficult to manage in some circumstances, in which case you repot to a larger pot that's got more media in that can hold on to more moisture. Another instance is your orchid's been in the pot too long and the media that it's in is starting to break down. So organic media like bark and moss will begin to break down and decompose, and this can become a very acidic environment very quickly, particularly with moss. So I think a general rule of thumb is if your orchid's in a moss heavy mix or pure moss, it needs repotting within the year, every year. If it's in a bark mix and you're letting it run drier, it can probably last 2 years. If it's in Orchiata, it might be longer. So you need to monitor how quickly your media is kind of decomposing, and it becomes quite, with bark, it'll become very squishy and start losing structure, and there'll be less air pockets in the media. All of that, it'll be holding on to more moisture and can contribute to root rot. So the roots will start to die off in very acidic or waterlogged conditions. So I would be repotting your Phalaenopsis in probably every year, to be honest, for me. But if it's growing slower, then that's not necessary. With bark, you can probably leave it 2 years. But for me, I repot in pretty much every year. It depends on how rapidly they're growing and the pot size that I repotted into originally. So in inorganic media, I don't need to worry about media breaking down and acidifying. So really all I need to worry about is when the Phalaenopsis or the orchid is completely taking over the pot with roots and it's drying out very quickly and quicker than I can manage with my self-watering or or semi-hydro setups, and as I said, I don't want them running dry. So for me, I like to repot regularly, and I like to repot before it becomes like the roots are filling the pot and you can't get the orchid out of the pot. So I like to repot quite often. That's a personal choice, and because I'm growing in inorganic, the repots don't disturb the orchids too much. So it's very much depending on circumstances and the orchids in question and the media that you're using. I hope that that's useful. Obviously it's a bit of a vague answer because it depends on so many different variables, but I hope that that's answered your question a little bit. So with that said, let's get started with the repot. I've got my trusty bucket here, so it's a dish, old dish container that I use for repots. I'm going to be using that as a repot. So we're going to get rid of this big one off the table first. I'm going to start with repotting that one. So I've already made up my pots I'm going to put them in. These ones, they're not going to get self-watering. I don't really have, well, I do, but they do fine in semi-hydro. So I'm just going to upgrade the pot size to a 16 centimetre white plastic pot and hope that that will be better. We'll have a look at the root system when we get it out, see what it needs. Obviously we need to go by the root system that the plant has. So I'm going to just pull it out of the pot. Another question I had was about the differences between self-watering and semi-hydro, and they are basically identical methods. I choose self-watering where the orchid is thirstier, because self-watering has a larger reservoir because the reservoir is just filled with water, whereas with semi-hydro the reservoir is filled with leca beads and water, which means that there's less water volume in total. So as you can see, all the roots are super dry on this particular phal. Like, it's completely dried out, which isn't ideal at all. But all the roots are alive. They just look a bit rubbish because they're all desiccated and dry. They need to be obviously constantly hydrated in leca, and they are not. It didn't have many roots when I got it, as you can see. There are no dead roots in the pot, so none of the roots have like died off during the transition. Surprised it doesn't have more, but it's been drying out quite a lot, which can be a bit prohibitive. If it keeps drying, it doesn't really encourage an ideal environment for root growth, and it also means it might not be getting enough nutrients and stuff. So it's okay, it's not great, but it's got new roots starting, so the new pot will be fine for it. And I've drilled the reservoir holes halfway up on this pot, so I can fill it halfway up each time I water. So to start with, I'm just going to reuse this old leca that's in the pot. It's got a little bit of salt build up at the top, but it's not too bad. That'll flush through. I'm just going to pour off the leca into the new pot. So I've filled sort of just up to the reservoir. When you repot, obviously these roots were in semi-hydro before, so these ones at the bottom had already been sitting in the reservoir, but obviously I've been letting that pot dry out a lot more than I should have. So they're not necessarily going to be adapted to a constantly wet environment. So when you repot, you don't want to put them straight into the reservoir. You want to let them grow into the reservoir. I'm just going to try and fit. I had another question on choosing pot size and whether orchids like to be root bound. Basically the advice about choosing the smallest pot possible and orchids liking to be root bound is to do with wet dry cycles. So if you think about it, if a pot is very small and the roots are taking up most of the space in that pot, it's going to dry out extremely fast. You're going to have to be watering it very fast. Orchids might well like that, but it's a lot more labour intensive on you. But it's important not to choose a pot that's too large for the root ball that you've got, because that means that the roots are going to stay soggy for longer. So your wet dry period is going to be much longer. So you're going to probably be looking at like a 2-week wet dry cycle as opposed to a week, which can make a massive difference for the orchid in question. So you really want to be choosing your pot size in organic media based on the root ball, and I would say probably you want to allow a couple of inches around each side of the roots, just to allow a year's worth of growth in that pot and to allow you to go sort of around a week without watering, because you don't want it to stay wet and soggy in the pot for longer than a week really with most orchids. So that doesn't really apply to inorganic media though, because like we said before, we've got the constant air gaps, so you've got constant oxygenation around the roots. So pot size with inorganic media is much less important than with organic media, if that makes sense. If you're using organic media, when it comes to choosing your media mix, you want to bear in mind that wet-dry cycle and just use the media as a tool to achieve that. So for example, in very hot climates with very low humidity, you may want to be using very moss-heavy mixes because moss holds a lot of water. However, in a cool, humid climate, that moss would be staying wet for weeks before you needed to water. And that's going to create a very soggy environment around the roots that in a cooler climate would be very bad for the orchids. So in a cooler, more humid setting, you would want to be using something like bark or very chunky grade bark, which has a lot of aeration and will dry very quickly. So it's really all about how you're growing, how you want to grow, and the environment that you're growing in as to your media choice as well. But I would say as a general rule, if you're growing in organic media, then you want the pot to be drying out within 1 week and for you to be rewatering when it just gets to dryness, not when it's completely bone dry for most orchids. So you can see signs of dehydration with a Phal from these wrinkling on the leaves. It's just been drying out too much, and that's completely my fault. So what I'm now going to do, now that I've got the Phal into the pot, I'm just going to fill around it. And because this Phalaenopsis is leaning, it's a little bit unruly. And they often do this after they've become more mature anyway, because Phalaenopsis will naturally kind of lean in nature if you think about how they grow on tree trunks. The light source for this one has been directly overhead. Some are just more prone to leaning than others. And what I'm going to do is just fill around with the new media, which is just going to be lacquer with a bit of pumice mixed in, just because I had that mix already prepared. Now, I did get a question on when Phalaenopsis orchids grow very long stems, what do you do when the roots starting having issues getting down into the media? Well, it depends really on the individual circumstances and the orchid in question and how many live roots it has in the pot, and how happy are you for those roots that are coming down from the stem to be aerial roots, or does it not have many roots in the pot and do you need it to put those new roots down into the pot kind of quite urgently? So I have a few orchids kind of getting to that stage with longer stems. Most of my Phals have retained the lower leaves though, and that's another point. So if your orchid doesn't have many lower roots or lower leaves, then why not just take that bottom portion off? If it's got lots of lower leaves and lots of roots in the pot, your decision is then, how big do I want this orchid to get? Does it have enough roots in the pot to sustain itself? If yes, then really no problem. If no, and the new roots aren't getting down into the pot, then I guess your next step would be to think about cutting the orchid. So the Phalaenopsis orchid obviously, and most other monopodial orchids, can produce either flower spikes or roots from lots of different nodes along the stem. As they get taller, obviously those nodes are higher away from the media, so what you could do is cut, for example this Phalaenopsis joy fairytale, I could cut pretty much in half. The bottom half would probably produce a keiki, obviously it would no longer have a growth point in the middle, and the top half is producing roots from the stem anyway, so that's an option. It depends on the situation really, and what you want to do and what you feel comfortable with doing. So I'm just going to take the media and fill around the Phalaenopsis. You can see the kind of level that I have potted it. I had a couple of questions about the individual differences between different types of Phalaenopsis. So the first one was, why do some Phalaenopsis do better in semi-hydro than others? Well, that's all to do with the species that go into your parentage of your complex hybrid or your primary hybrid or whatever Phalaenopsis you have. So a complex hybrid Phalaenopsis that we buy in a garden centre will often have some of the cooler growing or slightly more temperate species in its parentage, and so may tolerate slightly lower temperatures a little bit better than something like a Novelty Phalaenopsis hybrid that uses a lot of the Polychilus subgenus in its parentage. And even within those garden centre Phalaenopsis, they will all have different parentage, different species that go into them. Some of those will want drier periods, more distinct drying off between waterings. Some will want warmer temperatures and constant moisture. Some will want a slight cool down. It really depends on the species that have gone into your parentage of your whatever Phalaenopsis you have as to how well they're going to do in semi-hydro. And yeah, of course there will be differences between different hybrids that you get. That's completely natural, and it's just kind of learning as you go along. In my experience, the Polychilus subgenus Phalaenopsis So for example, the Valina and Violacea and their primary and complex hybrids will always do much better in semi-hydro than some of the cooler growing species, although I don't have many of them because they don't interest me as much. But in my experience, the more moisture loving Phalaenopsis that are found in hot, humid climates without much seasonal variation do much better, in my experience, in semi-hydro than some of the ones that want distinct dry periods, because, you know, we're providing a constantly moist environment. It makes sense that something that likes a lot of moisture will do better in semi-hydro. Having said that, my Phalaenopsis schilleriana, which is one that's supposed to really like a little bit more dryness in its media, is actually doing exceptionally well in semi-hydro, maybe better even than some of my complex hybrid Phalaenopsis. So I think it's just, you know, there are going to be differences between the species, and depending on how your environment interacts with the potting media could completely flip which species do well for you compared to somebody else, even in the same potting media. So just kind of a learning curve, I think, and yeah, there'll be differences and figuring out which ones work best in your environment. So now that I've potted my Phal, I'm just going to fill around the top layer with some larger grade beach pebbles. And I'm using these for Phalaenopsis at the moment because they're larger grade than my horticultural grit, so they allow the roots to access the media below better. And what this does is basically the top layer of leca can get very dry, and because it's a porous material that tries to wick water, what it does is when it's very dry, it can actually wick water away from the delicate root tips that hit it, which can cause root tips to dry out. So what I'm doing is putting a layer of pebbles that don't wick, so they're completely smooth, they're not porous, they're not able to suck moisture. So the top layer does stay dry, but what it doesn't do is suck moisture from new tips, because if you think about it, bark, the top layer will stay dry, but it doesn't desiccate roots in the same way that dry leca does. Just mitigating that dry top layer, or at least meaning that it isn't an issue. I did get one more question relating to my setup and temperatures and having a semi-hydro setup in a temperate climate. So I've kind of already answered a lot of aspects of this with the previous questions, but we'll just address a couple of specific points to this question. So I'm growing in a spare bedroom in the UK. I have a lot of grower lights running, which means that it gets warmer, and I specifically keep my setup above 18 degrees Celsius in winter, because going below that you're going to run into issues with warmer growers and root rot when you're keeping them in constantly moist clay media. So semi-hydro is definitely possible in cooler climates, but you'll just need to get different orchids involved. I wouldn't put any warmer growers in semi-hydro in cooler climates, because warmer growers will need to be kept drier in winter if you are keeping them cooler than they would like, because the last thing they're going to want is cold, wet, soggy roots. So I guess that answers your question. So I do put all of my kind of climate information in the descriptions usually for my videos. I'm growing in winter, it stays between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius. I make sure to keep it above 18 degrees Celsius at night. Summer, 22 to 35 degrees Celsius usually. Maximum 35 in the heat of summer. Humidity, when it's hotter, it stays around 40 to 50%. It has been dropping about 35% recently. In winter, this sort of averages between 60 and 70%. You'll have to address specific needs to your climate. If you're growing cooler, then semi-hydro for warm growers, probably not for you. If you're growing warmer, you might have more issues with dryness and the dry top layer, especially if you've got low humidity, although I'm growing quite warm with quite low humidity in summer. Anything above 35 Celsius and below 40% humidity probably isn't ideal for orchids anyway. I hope that kind of addresses your question together with the answer to the previous questions. Okay, so that is that Phal all repotted and done. And then we're going to move on to the next one. So the next Phal that we're going to repot is this Peloric hybrid. And Peloria refers to when the petals mimic the lip, at least in some way. True Pelorics would be like identical, but this one is just slightly mimicking the lip. You can see the little spur on it. It's very pretty. It means the flower is a little bit closed off, but I still think it is very pretty and unique. So I'm just going to do the same again. terrible. So you can see how dry this has been staying. Oh, poor little thing. So we're just going to put it into a larger pot and stop it drying out so fast. So I had a question from Christine on flower spikes between complex hybrid Phals and novelty or closer to species Phals. And basically, if they're still green, they've still got the potential to branch. And if they've gone brown and dried out like this one here, nothing's going to happen anymore, so you can cut that off. Novelty or closer to species Phalaenopsis often keep their flower spikes for many years, so I would never cut them off until they've pulled those resources back from them, the flower spike's dried and they've gone brown, and at that point you can remove. The exception to this being if the orchid is struggling, if it's not got many roots, you don't want it diverting lots of energy into flower spikes. So at that point, it's better to cut them back, but if they're still green, leave them alone. And if they start going brown or dried looking, then you can take them off. At that point, they won't branch anymore. I had a question from Super Mariella, and I really hope that that is a play on Super Mario, because I love Mario. Basically about the velumen versus the inner roots and how Phals could branch roots downstream of an area where the velumen was rotted, and also whether they are capable of producing keikis from roots. So I've got a really great video example where I actually showed this. So I'm going to try and pull that video clip out and just pause it on the section. So this section of root is essentially the velumen upstream is rotten, but you can really clearly see that the inner root is intact. The velumen is nothing more than a sponge. That is not the root that you're looking at. That thick fleshy coating of the root is nothing more than a coating. The actual inner root inside is what we're looking at in terms of whether a root is alive or not. Now often when that inner root dies, the velumen on the outside will die back too, which is why we say when roots are kind of brown and mushy that they are dead. But that's not always the case. Frequently the root inside can still be alive and just a portion of the velumen dies off. And that's how roots can branch downstream of a rotted area of velumen. And yes, roots do have the capacity to produce keikis from them, but it's extremely rare. You mentioned a Phal doing this. I've seen examples of it on Catacetinae and Catasetum types. It's very uncommon, but it can happen. So that, I guess that's your question. The actual outside of velumen of the root is not the root. It doesn't matter whether it's alive or dead, really. It's the inner root, that little fine hair, that's the actual root that delivers all of the nutrients and water to the orchid. And as long as there's a portion of velumen alive downstream on that live root, it can branch a new root from that velumen. So I'm just filling around, and what I like to do when I first fill is pop the orchid lower and then pull it up. And then just continue filling around with the media. So I'm just going to show you an example of what a dry top layer can do for a Phalaenopsis or an orchid that's particularly sensitive to it. Can you see that root tip there? It's hit that lacapede and it's burnt where the leca has sucked the water out of it because it was staying very dry at the top. So hopefully having a pebble top layer will help this little guy out a bit. So I have one more question on addressing sunburn on leaves and stimulating new leaf growth on Phalaenopsis. So once sunburn has happened, it's irreversible damage. It pretty much kills the cells in the leaf. So there's no recovering the leaf from that. You've just got to wait for the orchid to grow new leaves. In regard to stimulating new leaf growth, the orchid will do that if it's healthy and happy. Just give it the right conditions for it to thrive. So another thing you can do is feed a growth hormone stimulant. So something like seaweed extract, kelp extract, that will help stimulate new root and leaf growth. But yeah, there's nothing really special that you can do for new leaves. You just, once the orchid's finished flowering, it usually switches straight back into growth mode. So one thing you could do if it's currently flowering and you really want it to produce new roots and leaves, cut the flower spike and it'll probably switch over to growth mode. But there's nothing else you can really do other than just good culture and just wait and give it time, and I'm sure it will make new roots and new leaves when it's ready to. So I've just left a bit of a gap at the top of this pot so that I can add in the top layer of the smooth beach pebbles. And while I do that, I'll just answer another question I had on fertilizing, which was, are there any natural fertilizers to get reblooms? And that you'd heard baking soda might be good. So baking soda or sodium bicarbonate, I'm not sure that that would be classed as natural anyway, and it's certainly not a fertilizer. It would function as a pH up, but you wouldn't really want to do that unless you're tightly controlling your pH and you know that it's too acidic and you want to pH up. I wouldn't mess around with that unless you're kind of controlling your pH. I wouldn't add baking soda to as a fertilizer. For that reason, I would only ever use it as a pH up. In terms of natural fertilizers, there's lots of organic fertilizers. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by natural, but really you want to be looking at the NPK, so nitrogen, potassium, phosphates, and also whether there's calcium and magnesium in your fertilizer, and those are the 5 things that you really want to look for as essentials in a fertilizer. And if you've just got an NPK fertilizer, you can add extra calcium and magnesium in the form of CalMag. But I'm not sure exactly what you mean about natural, whether you just mean kind of homemade fertilizers, but I would honestly stick to good orchid fertilizer. You don't necessarily need a special brand, but you want it to have at least NPK and then top up with extra calcium, magnesium as necessary. You can get as complicated or as simple as you like with fertilizing, so I can only give you my opinion, and I would always feed those 5 things to orchids, and it's great if you can feed them micronutrients as well. You can certainly get organic fertilizers if that's what you mean. Fertilizers are building blocks that are used to assemble new structures like new growths, flower spikes, and light is what's giving your plant the energy to produce those. Just good culture all round, and your Phalaenopsis will reflower. There's not something really that you can do to stimulate it other than seasonal changes. The complex hybrid Phalaenopsis will often flower when there's a seasonal temperature drop, and average for like 2 weeks of a lower temperature, and that'll often induce flowering. But other than that, there's no special fertilizer that you can really give to prompt flowering. The bloom boosters and things, I personally would just feed a balanced fertilizer year round. My orchids don't have any issues flowering, and that's what I do. So that's, I guess, the advice I can give. I hope it's helpful and has partially answered the question at least. So those are my 2 Phalaenopsis all repotted into their fresh pots with now a top layer of the smooth river pebbles added, which will hopefully stop any dry top layer issues. Larger reservoirs, which will mean that they're not running out so quickly, because in those pots, I had them before, the bottom is actually domed. I don't know if you can see very clearly on that, but it is domed, which means that this reservoir is only sort of this big, like it's super small. That was definitely a mistake that I made early on when I was trying out semi-hydro, was putting the reservoirs too low, because that's just what I'd seen people doing. But for me, higher reservoirs mean that there's less distance that water has to travel, so the top layer doesn't stay quite so dry. In addition to this, I've added the top layer of the pebbles, so hopefully that will also help these Phals out. Yeah. We'll see how they do. Obviously they're not exactly looking terrible, but they could do way better, and that's the thing, is always kind of looking at how you can improve caring for your orchids, and this is a way that I think that these Phals would benefit from a little bit of a tweak. So we've done that. So obviously the best time to repot your Phalaenopsis or any orchid is when they are starting new growths, and spring is a great time to do that because we've got loads of new vegetative growth, making new leaves, making new roots. And this Phal is leaning, but I actually quite like this way Phals can display themselves. This has had an overhead light source and it's still leaning, so there's nothing I can do about this really. It's just one of those things, and I quite like it. When it gets longer, it will become quite unruly, and at that point we might have to think about some maintenance on it and trimming back the stem a bit, but for now I'm quite happy to let it just kind of droop over. Sign of a happy Phal in my opinion. So I had a couple of questions from you guys on orchids that I consider the care of to be extremely different to Phalaenopsis. So I've left them until last, asking for some updates on some different orchids and a bit of care advice. So the first one is on Sedirea japonica, which is obviously reclassified now to Phalaenopsis japonica, but I still would strongly suggest you treat this as a very separate entity to a Phalaenopsis. I keep mine in very different conditions to my Phalaenopsis types. So your first query was care and environment for it. So Sedirea japonicas are cooler growing than many Phalaenopsis and species and hybrids that you'll be kind of familiar with. So they want a cooler environment. They like a lot of moisture. So from what you're saying, outside should be fine with morning sun, maybe during summer, but I would monitor the temperatures because they don't really like to be too hot, and any direct sun on the leaves could risk burning them. So they are going to like the bright indirect light. You're in the UK, so you're in the same environment sort of as me. I keep my Sedirea japonicas down in the kitchen in a cooler environment because my grow room gets too hot for them year round, and they just grow a lot better for me down in the cooler, shadier kitchen. So I would just monitor your temperatures, and if you feel like your balcony is the best environment for it, then just obviously be careful with sunlight and getting too hot for too long. Just show you my kind of growing in my kitchen. I keep it in a Ceramis mix. I'm not sure what you're growing yours in. You ask about watering, so if you're growing it in bark, then soaking for 30 minutes is absolutely fine. You say dipping it in a pot just under the crown level, so I think you maybe mean below the lower leaves. Obviously don't get the crown or the stem or any water in between any of the leaf joints because that can risk rotting, but that's fine to do it once a week if it's in bark for 30 minutes soak, just as long as you're not getting any water on the stem or in between the leaves at all, and letting it dry off thoroughly afterwards. So my next question was on Macodes petola, and yes, I do have one. So I don't grow it in semi-hydro. I didn't even try. It's a terrestrial species. In my experience, they just like a bit more moisture than semi-hydro can give, so they tend to do a little bit better in finer mixes. So I'm growing mine in inorganic media. You can see it's doing really well. I got it just as a single growth, and it's making all these little plantlets, which I think is a pretty good sign. I haven't had it that long, but it's making lots of little side shoots and offshoots, and it keeps growing new leaves, so I think it's happy. Mine is in Vaxa pumice that you can get from IKEA, so very fine grade pumice. The bottom half is leca, but that's only up to where the water reservoir is, just because obviously there's more air gaps with leca, so it'll allow me to give more water in the base of the reservoir in this semi-hydro with pumice setup. But yeah, I use a fine grade pumice. It's doing really well in that. I personally probably wouldn't try semi-hydro unless you're growing it in a very humid, moist environment, because I think semi-hydro will be too dry for it, and I think you'll struggle with dry top layer issues. So those are my kind of Q&A answers and my repot session. I hope that this format was okay for you and not too disjointed, and thank you so much to everyone who contributed questions and asked me stuff, and I hope that my answers were okay and satisfactory. And obviously if I didn't clarify something that you wanted answered, then if you just pop a comment down below, I'll try and explain in a bit more detail if I've missed something out. I hope that I answered everything clearly for you guys. And obviously this was just a chatty repot with me, not necessarily the best repotting video, but hopefully this was an interesting format for you, and I hope you enjoyed it all. Thanks so much for watching today, and if you do have any questions, then leave a comment down below and pop any questions that you want answered in a Q&A in the comments as well, and I'll see you guys all later. Bye!